What if the very soul you feel was carved from the same fire as yours belongs to someone else's arms? What if destiny itself seems to play a cruel trick? In that moment, your spirit is torn between longing and fear, between surrender and rebellion, because the deepest bond you've ever known is bound by chains you cannot break, at least not without destroying the life they now live. Yet the story does not end in despair. For this is where transformation begins, where the unconscious calls you to confront the shadows of obsession, attachment, and desire. Every myth reminds us that great love often hides in forbidden places, and the question is not simply, why them, but why now? Ask yourself, do you cling to the illusion of possession, or do you awaken to a higher path where love transcends ownership? Imagine the turmoil of seeing their smile across the room, knowing it wasn't meant for you. Does it make you crumble? Or does it ignite the fire to grow so luminous they cannot help but feel your presence even from afar? Strange, isn't it, how life never hands us the script we expect, but always the one that forces our evolution. Stay with me, because what comes next is the revelation most people never dare to face. The truth of what really happens when your twin flame belongs to another. The connection awakens intense inner conflict between love and moral boundaries, stirring within the soul a storm that cannot easily be silenced. For when two individuals encounter one another on the level of a twin flame bond, it transcends ordinary attraction and ventures into the realm of spiritual inevitability. And yet, the human condition is not a vessel free from worldly responsibilities or moral frameworks. Rather, it is bound by the agreements, duties, and ethical lines that society, culture, and conscience have woven through centuries. And when love appears in its rawest, most fated form, while one or both individuals are tied by vows of marriage to another, the heart begins a battle against the mind, and desire enters into direct collision with principle, creating an internal war zone where every choice feels like betrayal and every silence feels like denial. For the soul whispers with urgency that this union is destiny, but the laws of morality remind you of loyalty, integrity, and the sanctity of promises, and this very paradox magnifies the suffering, for you are not wrestling against a trivial temptation, but against the magnitude of love that seems preordained by forces beyond human control. This conflict manifests in layers, beginning first with the intoxication of recognition, the magnetic pull that feels divine, irresistible, and utterly unique, a recognition of the self within another that surpasses logic and dismantles defenses. And as this recognition deepens, an individual feels simultaneously awakened and tormented, for to deny such connection feels like suppressing the soul's truth. Yet to pursue it may mean shattering the moral codes that uphold one's life, one's family, and one's honor. And so each heartbeat becomes a contradiction, a rhythm of longing intertwined with guilt, a melody of intimacy haunted by the echoes of responsibility. And here the person begins to see that love at its most profound does not arrive as a gift without cost, but as a test, a crucible designed to burn away illusions and expose what lies beneath. In the silence of reflection, questions arise, questions that pierce the very essence of being, such as whether true love can justify the breaking of promises, whether destiny can demand betrayal, whether the soul's yearning can absolve the consequences of action, and whether love is truly love if it leaves destruction in its wake. And these questions have no simple answers, for they force the heart into a dialogue with morality, with conscience, with divine law, and with the shadow within oneself. And the longer one contemplates, the sharper the tension grows, manifesting as sleepless nights, restless thoughts, and the inability to escape the other person's presence in both waking life and dreams. The conflict also awakens the shadow, for within each of us lies hidden desires, suppressed needs, and unacknowledged truths. And the twin flame bond brings these shadows to the surface with ruthless intensity, exposing unmet emotional hunger, revealing the cracks in existing relationships, highlighting the loneliness one tried to ignore, and magnifying the yearning for wholeness. And this sudden unveiling forces the individual to confront not only the reality of the twin flame, but also the flaws in themselves and the relationships they have built. For the encounter is not simply about romantic longing, but about facing what has been buried, and such confrontation is rarely peaceful. It tears at the ego, it shakes the structures of identity, and it demands choices that carry weight beyond the personal. Yet, in this battlefield of soul and conscience there lies transformation, because conflict is the birthplace of awareness, and awareness births growth. And while the connection threatens to devour stability, it also compels the individual to seek higher ground, to redefine love not as possession but as evolution, not as indulgence but as sacrifice, not as a selfish claim but as a mirror for one's own healing. And in this redefinition, the person discovers that the true challenge of the twin flame bond is not to collapse into passion blindly, but to elevate passion into wisdom, to hold desire without destroying integrity, to embrace love without forsaking principles. And this balancing act is what turns pain into purification. The inner conflict sharpens further when silence becomes unbearable. For though the individual may not speak openly of the connection, the energy pulses beneath every interaction, every glance, every thought, and it becomes a secret fire that consumes from within. A dual existence where one lives outwardly by moral law, but inwardly by the rhythm of soul bond. And in this silence lies both suffering and revelation. For it teaches restraint, it exposes the power of self-control, and it awakens compassion for oneself and others entangled in the web of choices. Yet the longing remains, testing the capacity of the human spirit to endure the ache of what cannot be possessed and the weight of what cannot be denied. The heart in such a state experiences paradoxes that defy explanation, such as feeling fulfilled by the simple knowledge that the twin flame exists while simultaneously feeling torn apart by the impossibility of union, or finding strength in moral restraint yet feeling weakened by emotional yearning, or sensing liberation in spiritual love yet feeling imprisoned by earthly commitments. And these paradoxes stretch the soul beyond comfort, forcing it to evolve. For the soul must learn to love without attachment, to honor without possession, to cherish without demand, and to grow even in absence. And such lessons carve wisdom into the fabric of being, transforming inner conflict into the very catalyst for spiritual maturity. Thus, the connection that awakens intense inner conflict between love and moral boundaries is not merely a punishment or curse, but an initiation into deeper awareness. A reminder that true love is not always about fulfillment, but often about transformation. That destiny is not always about having, but about becoming. That soul bonds are not always meant to break vows, but to illuminate the meaning of them. And in this illumination, the individual learns that love at its highest frequency does not demand betrayal of principle, but calls one to reconcile passion with integrity, soul with duty, and longing with surrender. And though the battle between love and morality may never fully resolve, the act of walking through it reshapes the individual into someone capable of holding paradox without collapsing under its weight. Someone who understands that love is not only ecstasy but also responsibility, not only fire but also discipline, and not only desire but also truth. The bond becomes a catalyst for personal growth rather than possession. Because when two souls meet in a way that transcends ordinary connection, it shakes the very foundations of how one views love, attachment, and identity, and instead of being about ownership, control, or the validation of ego, it forces the individual to reflect inwardly and confront the hidden aspects of the self that have been long ignored. For such a bond is not about keeping another person within reach, but about awakening parts of the psyche that had been asleep, pulling them into consciousness with undeniable force. And it is through this awakening that growth becomes inevitable, because one cannot encounter such a mirror of the soul without being compelled to change. The essence of such a connection challenges deeply ingrained patterns of attachment, for many approach relationships with the idea of possession, with the subtle belief that love means having the other, keeping them close, making them a source of identity or validation. But when a bond rooted in higher spiritual resonance enters one's life, this illusion is shattered because the intensity of it cannot be reduced to ownership. And instead of holding tightly, one is asked to let go. Instead of clinging, one is asked to release. And in that release emerges the painful yet liberating realization that love is not meant to confine, but to expand, not to shrink, but to elevate, and that growth often happens when we relinquish control. The bond acts as a mirror, reflecting the deepest wounds, the fears, and the unhealed shadows that have shaped one's existence, and through this reflection, personal growth arises, because what we cannot see in ourselves often remains hidden until another person illuminates it. And this mirror effect is not gentle. It is raw, piercing, and often unbearable, because it shows truths about insecurities, pride, selfishness, or avoidance that the conscious mind works hard to suppress. And yet, without this exposure, transformation would never take root, for it is only when these hidden fragments come into the light that they can be healed, and thus the bond becomes a teacher, not by granting comfort, but by demanding authenticity. In the depths of this connection, one learns that love without possession is paradoxically more powerful, for it does not diminish when physical presence is denied, nor does it collapse when distance or circumstances intervene. Rather, it continues to grow, weaving itself into the very fabric of the soul, proving that the true nature of love is not dependent on proximity but on resonance. And in realizing this, the individual begins to shift away from dependency toward inner stability, finding strength not in the assurance of another's presence, but in the discovery of their own wholeness. And this discovery is the very heart of personal growth. The bond becomes a spiritual fire that burns away illusions, and with each flame, it destroys the belief that happiness can be built solely on another person. It dismantles the fantasy that fulfillment comes through possession, and it reveals that the deepest joy arises from alignment with one's higher self. And in that alignment, relationships are no longer chains of expectation, but channels of mutual growth, where each person becomes a guide, a mirror, a catalyst for transformation, and the pain of separation or distance becomes less of a punishment and more of an invitation to deepen inner strength. This transformation is not easy, for the ego resists it fiercely, clinging to the idea of ownership, insisting that if love is real, it must be secured, defined, and claimed. But the bond dismantles this illusion by continuously pulling the individual back into self-reflection, by showing that attempts to control only lead to suffering, and that the more one tries to possess, the more love slips through the fingers, until surrender becomes the only path left. And in surrender, the individual begins to understand that true love liberates rather than confines, empowers rather than enslaves, and transforms rather than diminishes. As the bond pushes against the ego, it also awakens higher capacities within the soul, such as compassion, patience, forgiveness, and resilience, for to navigate such an intense connection requires the ability to endure longing without bitterness, to accept uncertainty without despair, and to cherish another without demanding ownership. And in cultivating these qualities, the individual discovers dimensions of themselves they never knew existed. They learn that love is vast enough to hold both presence and absence, both desire and restraint, both union and separation. And this realization stretches the heart to contain paradoxes, teaching that growth often happens not through getting what we want, but through learning to live fully, even when we do not. The bond also becomes a guide into self-love, for in realizing that possession is not the goal, the individual begins to ask what it means to be whole within themselves, what it means to stand firm without leaning entirely on another, and this question leads them to confront wounds of worthiness, abandonment, and fear of loneliness, forcing them to cultivate a love for themselves that is unconditional, unshaken by whether another stays or goes, and this cultivation of self-love becomes the cornerstone of all other growth, because only when one learns to hold themselves fully can they truly hold others without the chains of possession. Furthermore, the bond shifts one's perception of time and patience, because it does not conform to the timelines of ordinary relationships. It does not move in predictable stages of meeting, commitment, and union. Instead, it ebbs and flows, surges and retreats, often demanding years of waiting, healing, and evolving, and in this strange rhythm, one learns that love is not about immediacy, but about endurance, not about rushing to secure, but about allowing what is true to unfold in its time, and this patience becomes a spiritual discipline, one that teaches surrender, humility, and trust in forces beyond one's control. Even in moments of pain, when the desire to possess feels overwhelming and the reality of distance feels unbearable, the bond continues to act as a teacher, for it shows that the pain itself is a gateway to deeper understanding. It reveals that longing is not just a torment, but a force that sharpens awareness, heightens sensitivity, and deepens empathy. And through this process, the individual begins to see that every ache of the heart is also an expansion of the soul, every tear shed is also a baptism into greater strength, and every moment of yearning is also a reminder of the soul's capacity to love without condition. Thus, the bond that awakens becomes not a chain but a liberation, not a possession but a mirror, not an end, but a beginning, guiding the individual toward transformation that surpasses the boundaries of ordinary relationships. Because instead of reducing love to ownership, it elevates it to a spiritual discipline where the heart becomes both student and teacher, and in that discipline, the individual grows into someone capable of embracing love, not as a tool of control, but as a force of evolution, capable of holding desire without being destroyed by it, capable of releasing without losing, and capable of loving without needing to possess. And in this state of being, the bond continues to burn brightly, not as a cage, but as a light that illuminates the path of personal growth. Separation forces you to confront illusions and embrace spiritual maturity. Because when the soul is torn away from what it most deeply craves, the mind is stripped of comforting fantasies and forced to face reality in its rawest form. And in that exposure, illusions dissolve, revealing both the fragility and resilience of the human heart. For separation is not only an absence, but also a teacher, a relentless force that challenges every belief you have about love, identity, and belonging, pressing you to see whether your attachment was rooted in truth or in the mirage of dependency. And it is in this pressure that spiritual maturity begins to take shape, because only when illusions fall apart can wisdom emerge. At first, separation feels like a wound that refuses to heal, because the longing for connection, for touch, for validation becomes so consuming that the mind invents stories to cope, stories that suggest maybe they will return soon, maybe circumstances will change, maybe destiny will bend in your favor. But with time, those stories reveal themselves to be nothing more than projections of desire, and as each illusion crumbles, it forces you to ask deeper questions about what love truly means, and whether it is defined by proximity, possession, or presence in the heart. And this questioning is the beginning of spiritual awakening, because it shifts focus from the external to the internal. The illusions that separation dismantles are not only about love, but also about the self, because in the presence of another, it is easy to define yourself by their reflection, by how they see you, love you, or validate your worth. But in their absence, that mirror is gone, and you are left standing face to face with your own image, raw and unfiltered. And this confrontation is terrifying, because it reveals insecurities, doubts, and unhealed wounds that were once hidden beneath the comfort of companionship. And yet it is through this confrontation that growth becomes possible, because without the illusion of being completed by another, you must learn to complete yourself. Separation teaches that clinging to illusions only prolongs suffering, for as long as you live in the belief that fulfillment lies outside of you, in another person's presence or attention, you remain a prisoner of longing. But once you recognize that this longing is a reflection of something within yourself, a call to heal, to awaken, to grow, the suffering begins to transform into strength, and the absence of the other becomes less of a punishment and more of an initiation into deeper self-awareness. And this shift marks the path from emotional immaturity to spiritual maturity, Spiritual maturity requires accepting paradoxes that the ego resists, such as the reality that love can be real even without physical closeness, that connection can remain alive even when the bond is invisible, that fulfillment is possible even in solitude, and these paradoxes stretch the heart, forcing it to expand beyond the narrow definitions of romance, possession, and control, teaching instead that love is not about holding but about becoming, not about taking but about giving, not about owning but about honoring. And in learning these truths, one begins to shed the illusions that kept them bound to small, conditional forms of love. Separation also awakens the awareness of impermanence, reminding us that nothing in this life can be fully held, no matter how deeply we desire it. And instead of resisting this truth, spiritual maturity learns to embrace it, to find peace not in permanence, but in presence, to love fully without demanding forever, to cherish deeply without fearing loss. And this acceptance of impermanence transforms how we engage with life. For instead of clinging, we begin to flow. Instead of fearing change, we begin to trust it. And in that trust, we uncover a freedom that illusions never offered. The process of confronting illusions through separation is deeply humbling because it reveals how much of what we thought was strength was actually dependency, how much of what we believed was love was actually attachment, and how much of what we called connection was actually projection of unmet needs. And though this revelation is painful, it also frees the soul from repeating the same patterns. For once illusions are recognized, they lose their power, and in their place emerges clarity, discernment, and the courage to love in ways that are not bound by fear or control. Through separation, one also encounters the deeper layers of the self, the spiritual essence that exists beyond the grasp of relationships, beyond roles and attachments, and in accessing this essence, one discovers an inner source of love and strength that cannot be taken away, for it does not depend on another's presence or approval. And this discovery is the foundation of spiritual maturity, because it teaches that the true source of love has always been within, and every external bond is merely a reflection of that inner reservoir, and the absence of another becomes the doorway through which you learn to access it.